Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A few weeks ago, I was in Arlington National Cemetery, just above Washington, D.C. It's a very moving experience, of course, particularly the JFK memorial and the rest of the Kennedys, which I dutifully went to, but right next to it, adjacent to all the Kennedy memorabilia, if that's the right word, is the grave of a man less well known, but nonetheless in some ways perhaps even more interesting, more tragic, more complex than any of the Kennedys, a man called Robert Strange McNamara, a remarkable character, one of the great achievers, perhaps a pin-up boy for a post-war American meritocracy, one of our best and brightest, who had a rather tragic life on lots of fronts and was the man most associated, I think, with the tragic catastrophe in Vietnam, America's terrible adventure there. We have a new book out about McNamara. It's by an old friend of the show, Philip Taubman. He's co-authored it with his elder brother, 6-year elder brother, Bill Taubman, William Taubman, and I'm thrilled that Philip is joining us. Philip, as we joked at the beginning, I've got your lower third as McNamara at war, but it's a new history. There are lots of old histories of McNamara. Why write a book about McNamara? So much has already been written.
Well, I felt that way myself before we started on the project. But what triggered the book and the research that went into it was a set of new materials, some of which McNamara had left in the possession of his wife, his second wife, when he died in 2009. And when I got a look at that material, I realized that there ought to be another book written about Robert McNamara. And then, you know, as the research proceeded, one gets the benefit of material that's been declassified. You would think that Vietnam War era government documents would have been declassified decades ago, but actually some of them have been declassified in the years since the bulk of the books about McNamara were written in the mid-1990s.
Last year, we did another McNamara show with Peter Osnos, another old friend of the show. I'm sure you're all too familiar with Peter, quite a character, a man with a great history in American publishing. It was about his relationship, McNamara's relationship with LBJ. Do you think for these books on McNamara, Philip, you have to come with a McNamara opinion, either a bad guy or a good guy or a complicated guy or a tragic guy?
Well, I think certainly people in my generation who grew up during the Vietnam War, many of them will come to these books with a preconceived view. McNamara was reviled, still is by many people, because he was largely responsible with prosecuting the Vietnam War, in which, you know, 55,000 plus Americans died and millions of Vietnamese to no good end. And so I think the book will be greeted by an audience of readers, some of whom come to it with hostility about McNamara. I hope they learn some new things about McNamara from the book, The book is not exculpatory. It does not excuse Robert McNamara for his role in Vietnam. But I think it does shed some new light on why he did the things that he did, why he made the mistakes that he did.
When you look at a photo now of McNamara, he looks like a character in a Stanley Kubrick movie. We talked earlier in this week, we did a show on American foreign policy, and of course, Dr. Strangelove comes up. He looks like a character who might have been in Strangelove. Tell us a little bit about McNamara, his background, and why he's such a symbolic figure in both all the promise and tragedy of post-war America.
Yeah, I think you rightly identified him as a kind of acme of the post-war meritocracy in America. So McNamara, was a standout student from the get-go. He grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, went to the University of California at Berkeley, where he excelled academically.
Before, just to jump in here, I'm sure everyone's thinking this, from a wealthy family, a poor family, a happy family, an unhappy family?
From a middle-class family. His father was a shoe salesman who did okay during the Depression, unlike some of McNamara's friends in the Bay Area whose families were crushed by the Great Depression. The McNamaras got through it, but they were not wealthy.
Where in the Bay Area did he grow up?
Well, they lived on the border of Berkeley and Piedmont. And if you know the Bay Area.
I know very well. In fact, I lived very close to there for many years.
So, Piedmont is a high-end area in many respects. And they settled right on the border. And I think his mother and father fancied themselves to be Piedmont residents. They were actually Berkeley residents.
Near the old Claremont Hotel, did they?
Yeah, not that far. It was a ways away, but not that far. And in fact, when McNamara was going to Berkeley, he had access to a car, and he would drive over every day from their residence to the campus.
Yes, just down the hill. What kind of childhood did he have? Was it the quintessential childhood of the 50s of baseball and apple pie?
Well, it was a childhood of the 20s and 30s. It was I guess not an uncommon phenomenon in American families, but in his case, his father was a distant figure, quasi-successful as a shoe salesman, very, very aloof from the family.
You brought up this shoe salesman thing a couple of times.
Well,
should we? Is the other shoe, so to speak, about to drop here? Is that particularly significant?
I don't think so.
Did he have a, again, excusing the pun, did he have a, if not a shoe, a chip on his shoulder? Did he think he was made for better things than selling shoes?
I think that's probably true. He dressed in a kind of dandyish fashion.
So a slightly tragic figure, but in a very down-to-earth kind of way. The classic tragedy of the 20s and 30s, someone who thought they should have done better in their lives, but taken over by forces that they probably neither understood nor could certainly control.
Yeah, and you're familiar, no doubt, with the Arthur Miller play, Death of a Salesman.
Of course, yeah. I just watched the movie again. One of the great films, certainly one of the great dramas.
Yeah, one of the great American dramas. And, McNamara's father was not a Willy Loman figure. But it's interesting. I'm going to vault ahead for just 1 second. Decades later, when McNamara went to see a production of Death of a Salesman in New York, this was, I believe, after his service as the defense secretary, he broke down in tears at the theater. So it obviously resonated with him.
And we shouldn't mention only his father. What about his mom? Was she staying at home? How many brothers and sisters did McNamara have?
Well, it's important to understand, and I think it helps explain McNamara. Yes, he had a sister, but he was the star in the family. And his mother doted on him, and his mother, drilled into him the expectations that he would be a brilliant student, which indeed he was. But I think the troubles of Robert McNamara can be traced back to the pressures, to some extent, that his mother put on him to excel as a student.
You're going to anger, Philip, the feminist crowd. You're going to blame it all on the mom, not the dad?
Well, the father was involved in McNamara's education by and large. It was the mother who was on the school committees. It was the mother who monitored the grades as they came in. It was the mother later, when McNamara went to Harvard Business School, who was constantly in correspondence with him about how he was doing. And by the way, the letters that she wrote to McNamara are part of the new materials that we have.
So it's the kind of opposite of Trump, whose mother seemed to be missing in action, dominated by the father. Is there a Madame Bovary quality to the mother? Unhappy, married to a shoe salesman, channeled all her ambition and energy into her good-looking son?
I think to some extent, exactly.
So here we have a young boy, does very well, goes to Berkeley, goes down the hill to Cal. He graduated from there, and then he went over to Harvard Business School, of all places.
Yes, and he went unclear about what he really intended to do. This was not a student going to Harvard Business School determined to make a name for himself in corporate America. Even as he was studying at Harvard, he continued to entertain thoughts that maybe he should go to medical school.
Yeah, which is not unusual. I mean, this was the Harvard Business School pre-Zuckerberg and Bezos and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. What did people go to Harvard Business School? So he was there, what, in the 40s?
Yeah, he was there in the late 30s and early 40s.
So when you went to Harvard Business School, were you training to be a gray man, training to be a corporate bureaucrat?
Yeah, I think that was what most people who went to Harvard Business School in that era saw it as a gateway to a career as a corporate executive in the United States.
And was he particularly, I mean, he's clearly a very talented young man, quite good looking. Was he particularly driven, do you think, compared to other talented people who came out of the meritocracy in the 30s and 40s?
Well, I think, it's a little hard to gauge how he compared to, peers across the board. But certainly, if you look at the interactions that took place at Harvard Business School, and you look at his record at Harvard Business School, he was the standout student in his class at Harvard Business School by and large. His buddies, some of whom had come to Harvard Business School with him from Berkeley, to them and on through the decades afterward, Bob McNamara was the superstar, the brainiac, the brilliant man who could not fail at whatever he did until Vietnam.
Yeah, well, you're giving away the end of the story, Philip. We got to build up the momentum, the tragedy. So he goes to Harvard Business School, excels, and then does very well. Everyone expecting everything of him, including his mother. What about his politics? Those were the days of Truman. Did he have a take? Did he have a natural political party? Did he have pictures of FDR on his wall? What kind of politics existed in his family? Was it apolitical?
Well, he became a Roosevelt Democrat. I think it's a little hard to determine exactly what his parents' views were. But even at Harvard, he talked about the need to pursue domestic policies that would lead to, more income equity in the United States. So, he was what we would traditionally describe as a Roosevelt Democrat.
So he had never had the misfortune of reading Ayn Rand and fantasizing about capitalism and doing away with the state or any of that sort of thing?
Not that we could detect.
Maybe that will come out in the next batch of letters. So he went from Harvard Business School. Did he go straight to Ford, or what happened between Harvard and Ford?
No, it's very interesting. So the war was breaking out while he was at Harvard, World War II. And the Army Air Corps, there was not a United States Air Force yet. That didn't come until after the war. The Army Air Corps was looking for data that it could use to wage an air war in the Pacific and in Europe. Data about the airplanes, the bombers, and the fighter planes that were involved. Data about bomb damage assessments after bombs were dropped in the Pacific theater and in Germany. And the head of the Army Air Corps, General Hap Arnold, recruited a young man named Tex Thornton, who believed in data. And Tex turned to Harvard Business School to train people to move into the Army Air Corps as statisticians. And Bob McNamara was one of those people at Harvard Business School.
So in a sense, he was at Harvard Business School, but he could have been down Mass Ave at MIT, where they were inventing the internet and inventing a science which now we take for granted as data science. Was he always technical or technological, always comfortable with new things, with new kinds of technology, particularly the computers that were just becoming real as opposed to simply science fiction?
Well, he was brilliant at manipulating and understanding data and statistics. He was a very, strong math student. But there was another side to Bob McNamara we can get into, which was his love of poetry. But at Harvard Business School, he focused on data issues and then was drawn into World War II, into the Army Air Corps, to assess, analyze data, and put it to work to wage war. And eventually got involved in helping to plan the bombing raids on Tokyo, the devastating bombing raids, firebombing raids on Tokyo that led to the incineration of tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, and you yourself are all too familiar with that. One of your books was entitled Partnership: 5 Cold Warriors and Their Quest to ban the bomb. So you're all too familiar with the moral complexity of warfare. So he was a poet and a business student, a standout at Cal, but did he get an ethical education? What was that something that, because this comes out in the tragedy, I think, of Vietnam, was he religious? Was he political? Was he missing something in terms of this remarkable CV that he was putting together?
Yes and no. So let me explain that. On the yes side, what he was missing, it turned out, was not an inner sense of morality. It was not an inner sense of ethics. He did have those, but he suppressed them. And he began to live a double life, which is a theme in the book, where I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but where he came to doubt what he was doing in prosecuting the war in Vietnam, proceeded anyway.
Yeah, Dr. Freud would probably make something about double life. Was the poetry, do you think, a consequence of this double life, or a cause, or a little bit of both?
Well, I think it reflected the humane side of McNamara, the side that was interested in the mysteries of the soul, and he was drawn to poetry. And he
what kind of poetry? What was it? Who were his favorite poets?
Well, Rudyard Kipling, for example. He liked to read poetry aloud with women with whom he was dating. And this became true later with Jacqueline Kennedy.
Wasn't Kipling a poet of Anglo-colonialization? Maybe he learned something from that. Anyway, so what about the World Bank piece of it all? He worked at Ford and he worked at the World Bank. So he made all the right choices. Harvard Business School, Ford, the World Bank. Was he happy when he was doing all these things?
Well, you know, the World Bank came after the Pentagon, and it was LBJ's way of kicking McNamara out of.
Okay, so the World Bank was a kind of retirement job. But what about Ford?
So, you know, as the war wound down, the top statistical so-called whiz kids at stat control at the Army Air Corps got together, and Tex Thornton, their leader, said, listen, if we get 10 of us, we can offer our services to American corporate leaders, and we can go and help them run their company and make more money. So Tex sent a letter to Henry Ford. Henry Ford bought the idea, brought them up to Detroit, and gave them all jobs, including McNamara. And of that group of 10 or so who went to work at Ford right after the war, McNamara quickly emerged as the star. And by the time we get to the late 1950s, he's becoming president of Ford Motor Company.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Henry Ford, because this is a moral tale, or perhaps an amoral tale, or a tale lacking morality. Henry Ford, of course, was a notorious anti-Semite, politically very controversial. Did McNamara ignore that, avoid it? Or was it something that you don't think is even worth mentioning?
Well, I think I don't know if he knew about it. It's hard to believe he didn't. Certainly.
Well, I mean, it was pretty public.
Yes,
Ford's
exactly.
position on the Jews and on American isolationism, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. You know, by the time McNamara went to work at Ford, old man Ford was gone.
Okay, so this was the son of Ford.
But his son was running it, and not running it very effectively. And so I doubt that figured in McNamara's mind. The Ford Motor Company that he went to work for was in terrible shape after the war. You know, it had converted to building tanks and other military equipment, and couldn't figure out how to turn itself back into an effective and profitable automobile company. And that's why, you know, Ford brought them in, the son of the founder, to help rebuild Ford and make it profitable again.
So the story so far, Philip, is not particularly exceptional. A young, talented fellow comes out of the Depression, strong mother, absent father, does brilliantly at college, goes to Harvard Business School, works in corporate America. What happened to make this an American story rather than just another story of maybe a rather frustrated but nonetheless successful corporate executive in mid-century America?
What happened was the election of John Kennedy as president, and Kennedy did not know McNamara. McNamara knew none of the Kennedy family, but several of John Kennedy's close advisors said, if you're looking for a very effective defense secretary, you better take a look at Bob McNamara at Ford. And he did, and their courtship was brief and odd, in the sense that McNamara really wasn't sure he wanted to be defense secretary, or that he was qualified to be defense secretary. At first, when the job was offered, he turned it down and said, I'm not qualified. And then he was asked by Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, would you like to be Treasury Secretary? And McNamara said, I'm not qualified to do that either. But Kennedy was taken with him because of his effective management at Ford, and thought correctly, as it turned out, that Bob McNamara could radically reform the Pentagon, which is what he did. And that chapter of McNamara's time in Washington before he got enmeshed in Vietnam was a story of actually great success, so much so that the changes he introduced, consolidated budgets, real civilian control of the Pentagon, outlasted him and are still the rule of the road today at the Pentagon, or war, until the Trump administration.
Yeah, we did a show earlier this week about reforms at the Pentagon, the Silicon Valley invasion of the Pentagon, and all the other consequences of that. So it's a remarkable story. So he went from running forward to becoming JFK's Secretary of Defense.
Right. And there's a funny moment when McNamara is at Kennedy's home in Georgetown in Washington, and they're meeting, and Bobby Kennedy is there with John Kennedy, and they're talking to McNamara. And McNamara says, well, look, I don't think I'm qualified. I have no training. And John Kennedy says to him, look, there's no school for presidents either. So he took a chance with McNamara, and it actually worked out quite effectively while Kennedy was still alive. The tragedy of McNamara really began in earnest under the presidency of Lyndon Johnson.
And that's true of others as well. LBJ was a notoriously unpleasant character. We'll get to that in a second. What about McNamara's involvement or lack of involvement in the two great foreign policy crises of the JFK age, the Bay of Pigs and then the Cuban Missile Crisis? Was he marginal to that or central to those stories?
No, the Bay of Pigs, he was out to lunch, basically, and did so.
That doesn't sound very good for the secretary to be out of lunch for that sort of thing.
Well, I say that figuratively, but he took himself out of the Bay of Pigs deliberations, believing that everything was being organized, which it was, by the CIA, and the Pentagon was only peripherally involved. So he later regretted that. He later felt that had he gotten involved and understood the flawed planning for the Bay of Pigs invasion, he might have been able to prevent it. And then he was deeply, deeply involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the first phase of the crisis, he was one of the Kennedy advisors, members of the so-called ExecCom, the executive committee that was making decisions. McNamara was basically a dove in that committee, if that's the right word. He advocated restraint. He opposed a immediate military invasion of Cuba to take out the missiles. And as the crisis unfolded over 13 days, he sort of transitioned into more of a hawkish figure.
Was he smartly political? Did he understand that these were tricky days? Not only was the world potentially ending, but maybe his political career. Did he have smart political instincts, or was he reflecting some sort of core set of moral or political beliefs in terms of his changes during the missile crisis?
No, I think the change reflected his role. When you look at his conduct in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was pretty strictly within the boundaries of what you would want from a Secretary of Defense, which means I'm not expecting, if I'm president, for the Secretary of Defense to come in and make moral arguments about potential blood spilled if we invade. It was more calculated, cold-blooded in a way, advice about what would or wouldn't work, militarily. And then as time went on, and it was unclear if the crisis would end peacefully, and the United States put up the quarantine or naval blockade around Cuba, McNamara put together plans for an invasion, contingency plans. And I think historians have a split view when they look back at his conduct in the latter parts of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Looking at those contingency plans, some people argue that he was pushing to invade at that point. I think my brother and I look at it and feel it's more the Secretary of Defense giving the president invasion plans without advocating that they be operational.
And then, of course, came Dallas, 1963 in November. A new president, LBJ. Peter Osnes's book also focuses on the relationship, this tragic relationship between LBJ and McNamara. What's your analysis, and is this the core of the McNamara tragedy, Philip?
Yeah, well, the core of the McNamara tragedy is what happened in the Johnson presidency in Vietnam. So as the Kennedy administration was still making decisions before the assassination, McNamara thought that Kennedy might well withdraw the American advisors, quote unquote, military advisors that were in Vietnam. John Kennedy had not committed combat troops to Vietnam. They were sent over in an advisory role. In steps Johnson after the assassination. And, you know, one of the early turning points was the Gulf of Tonkin episode in August of 1964. Johnson's now president. He's going to be running on his own right to be elected president in the fall of 64.
And he had enormous insecurities, of course, about that.
Yeah,
and obsessed with the Kennedys, and particularly with Bobby Kennedy.
Indeed. And there was this incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. I won't go into the details, but and in historic retrospect, it's clear that not a hell of a lot actually happened out there in terms of Vietnamese firing on Americans or Americans firing on North Vietnamese. But the early intelligence that came back to Washington, the early reports on what had happened, suggested there had been an attack by North Vietnamese forces on American Navy ships. And that led to the vote in Congress, nearly unanimous, for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that Johnson pushed and McNamara supported, that basically gave Johnson the license that he later used to send hundreds of thousands of combat troops to Vietnam.
A huge tragedy, of course. How much did he wrestle with this morally? His son recently came out with a book, The Sins of My Father. I mean, maybe we'll get to his family and his wife and his kids later. But how aware, in your view, in terms of your retelling of the McNamara story in your new history, how aware was he, or when did he become aware that this really wasn't just another rather ill-advised foreign war, but an absolute catastrophe for America, of course, and for the tens of thousands of Americans who would die there, and not to mention the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people locally who would die?
So the pivotal years are 1965 and 1966. That is the crucible in which McNamara, at the beginning, advocated for massive escalation. In July of 65, he was the leading advocate in Johnson's inner circle of sending hundreds of thousands of combat troops to Vietnam. Those were the decisions taken in the summer of 65 that made it an American war. By the fall of 65, just a few months later, he had concluded that the war was unwinnable militarily.
Yeah, say that again. And did he actually say that or write that?
Yeah. So here, one of the documents that we found and I think is a critical item in our book is a diary, a secret diary that was kept by McNamara's top Vietnam policy aide at the Pentagon, a man named John McNaughton. And McNaughton kept this diary in 66 and 67, and he recorded in it in April early April 1966. We're now 9 months, just 9 months after the massive escalation of American involvement in Vietnam. And he records Robert McNamara saying, "I want to bring the boys home from Vietnam so bad I can hardly stand it."
Well, that doesn't mean he was saying that they were going to lose, that it was a losing war, and that would be a natural thing to say. It's not
No,
exceptional.
I think I would disagree with that. I think it reflected his feeling that the war was unwinnable militarily. It wasn't just that Americans were dying in Vietnam and he wanted to bring them home. I think his motivation at that point was Americans are dying in Vietnam in a war that's unwinnable. So we're killing our sons in Vietnam for no apparent reason. And yes, he believed in the domino theory, which held that if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism, and eventually, the communists would be knocking on the door in San Francisco Bay. But I think it's at this critical moment in late 65 and 66 that he comes to the moral realization that we have made a grave error.
And this is, of course, your thesis of a double life, because he was a poet, a scholar, a stand-up guy who ran forward. He impressed everyone. JFK begged him to work for him, gave him any job pretty much he wanted in the administration. And yet here was a guy who dragged America, was perhaps with LBJ responsible for this catastrophe, which America is still recovering from. What's your explanation? Is it hubris, double life? Was there something wrong with the guy?
Well, I think it's the explanation has a number of reasons. One of them, which is of course typical in Washington, is people get Potomac fever. They like exercising power. They don't want to give it up. That's a kind of conventional reason, and McNamara certainly was subject to that. But the more important reasons for him, and I think the single most important reason, was a sense of contorted loyalty to Johnson and the office of the president. After he left the Pentagon, he gave an interview to Life magazine. And it's really an extraordinary interview. We include some of it in the book. And he addressed the question that you just asked. Why didn't he leave? Why didn't he quit? Why didn't he quit and oppose the war publicly? And the answer he gave was loyalty to the president. And when the Life writer challenged him about that loyalty, he said, look, there's this kind of phony notion in Washington about a higher calling when you're in public office. That's nonsense. The job you have when you go in, and I did when I went to be defense secretary, was to serve the president of the United States, who was elected by the American people. And if you're familiar, I know you are, with the oath of office that cabinet secretaries take, Bob McNamara among them, it's about defending the Constitution and protecting the Constitution of the United States. There's not a word in the oath of office about the presidency.
Yeah, and LBJ was a notoriously unpleasant boss, wasn't he? I mean, he bullied his vice president, and he was a remarkably bullying character. What kind of relationship did LBJ have with McNamara? Did he manage to bully him as he bullied practically everyone else around him?
He did bully him at times, but more than that, I think he manipulated McNamara very effectively. But he did it more with flattery than with threats. Unlike many of his aides, Johnson actually admired McNamara a great deal, depended on him a great deal. At one point said to him, I want to make you essentially, the head of the cabinet. elevating him above all other cabinet members. That didn't happen, but that indicated the kind of regard that LBJ had for McNamara. But it was a whipsaw kind of arrangement. I'm reminded of it watching Trump with some of his cabinet members. You know, one day LBJ was lathering on the flattery with McNamara, and the next day he was savaging him about his conduct. And I think that put McNamara off balance. And so I think that also contributed to McNamara's conduct.
Maybe this is a rather naive question, Philip, but did he have no moral compass? You said that he gave an interview saying that his only responsibility was to serve the president. I mean, what happens if that president decided to launch a nuclear missile at Vietnam, or bomb Cambodia so that all its inhabitants would die, or go to war with China over Vietnam? Was there nothing? Did he have was there no scenario, moral scenario where McNamara might have said, enough is enough, I'm not going to do this job anymore, I'm not willing to serve, it's the wrong job, let someone else do it?
Well, you know, you raise the question of morality of use of nuclear weapons, and that's very apt because during the Vietnam War, there were advocates among the military brass for escalating even beyond what Johnson and McNamara had done.
Yeah, the Strangeloves in the administration, of course, who also wanted to bomb Cuba during the missile crisis.
Right, the prospect of using nuclear weapons was on the table. And I don't know if it tells you that McNamara was a moral man or LBJ was a moral man, but in both cases, they resisted the idea of escalating to the point where there might be a nuclear confrontation. But let's take nuclear weapons out of the equation for a moment. I think the part of the tragedy of McNamara and part of the dual life of McNamara was that there was a moral compass deep inside him, and it kept rising up, and he kept pushing it down. And this led to the kind of psychological and emotional turmoil that was evident in him in his latter years at the Defense Department and on through the rest of his life. So I think the succinct answer to your question was that yes, there was a sense of morality, but it was almost always suppressed to do whatever it was he thought the president wanted him to do.
What does it tell us? I know it's all too easy probably to make general pronouncements on McNamara's life, but does it suggest something about his generation, these best and brightest who went to Harvard Business School and then into corporations? Was he not ready, not trained? Might he have gone to theology school or done a PhD in political philosophy? Things might have been different. Does he speak in a rather dark way about his generation? I mean, he was unique, or he was the model of his generation. He was the top boy in every class he was in. But what does that tell us about post-war America?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I would draw your attention to a speech he gave in Montreal in 1966. He went up there and gave a long speech that could have been delivered by a literature professor or a philosophy professor. It bore almost no resemblance to a speech that a sitting Secretary of Defense would give. And I think in that speech, you see the inner McNamara coming out. And frankly, it's interesting what happened in the aftermath of that speech. Some of the journalists in Washington in that era, like James Reston and Mary McGrory, read the speech and they wrote columns saying, well, look, my gosh, this is the real Robert McNamara. Johnson heard about it, and his attitude was basically, what the hell were you doing up there in Montreal? So, you know, I think For McNamara's generation, there was, and I think it's true today, or one would hope it is true today, that anyone who goes into public service, especially at the level of a cabinet member in the United States government, has to weigh a choice between acting on what their moral compass tells them to do and acting on what the chief executive or the president of the United States wants them to do. The very rare occasions have American officials hit that dilemma and resigned in protest. McNamara hit that pivotal point and stuck it out as defense secretary.
Maybe we should hope that some of the Trump appointees will be invited up to give speeches in Montreal or Toronto. Canada brings out everyone's truth, Philip. So a couple of brief questions. You've been very generous with your time. So what was his fate? When did he get fired or did he quit?
He didn't know. The truth is he got fired. McNamara became disillusioned with him. He thought effectively.
You mean LBJ got disillusioned?
I'm sorry. Yes, excuse me. LBJ became disillusioned with McNamara. Thought he'd gone soft on Vietnam, basically, and found
which
a way
he had.
Yes, he had.
Better or worse.
Yeah, he had, and indeed, in his last year or so at the Pentagon, he kept carrying out LBJ's policies, which were in some ways expanding the war. But at the same time, he was working feverishly to try to encourage peace negotiations. But LBJ realized that McNamara not only was going soft on Vietnam, but was becoming emotionally unsettled. And so he found...
is that a euphemism, emotionally unsettled, Philip?
Well, no, it is a euphemism. He was having an emotional breakdown, basically. And that could be seen. There's a very dramatic moment towards the end of his service as defense secretary when Johnson is awarding him I guess it was a Medal of Freedom, or one of the highest civilian honors in the United States, and McNamara cannot speak at the ceremony in the White House. He breaks down in tears. He's speechless. So the World Bank was a way for LBJ gracefully to kick him out to pasture.
Yeah, one of his sons, at least, wrote a book about the sins of my father. The standard narrative here, just as he had a very strong mom who made him, was there a wife who he talked to who might have been able to help? A lot of these characters, from LBJ to JFK, all had interesting wives. I know he had a particularly interesting relationship with Jackie Kennedy. Wasn't he able to go home as a corporate powerhouse and talk to his wife who might help him through this crisis?
I think he regretted later in life that he hadn't confided more in his family. He did confide to some extent in his wife, Margie. He didn't really confide in his two daughters and his son. And he came to regret that. And when you look at the course of the Vietnam War, it seems to me, having read the letters that Jackie Kennedy wrote him that are very admiring and affectionate, that he actually may have confided more in her about his doubts about the war than he did with his family, including his wife.
Was he a loyal husband?
He yes and no. He certainly was publicly devoted to his wife and talked about her incessantly as the most important person in his life. But then later in her life, when she fell ill, he began a relationship with a married woman in Washington named Joan Braden. Their relationship became quite well known, infamous at the time. They traveled together. In the book, we quote Sally Quinn, the former Washington Post reporter, describing a party on Embassy Row in Washington at a time when Margie McNamara, Bob McNamara's wife, was very sick. And Bob McNamara, according to Sally Quinn, was dancing at this gala in a way that it was clear that he and Joan Braden, had a physical relationship, not just a platonic relationship.
So what's the final score on this guy? The more you talk about him, I have to admit, Philip, maybe I'm a bit biased. I'm not sure I would describe him as a monster, but he's certainly a very dubious character on every front. His wife's dying. He's running around Washington, D.C. With another woman. He drags America into a war that he knows it can't win. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers lose their lives. Millions of people's lives are ruined. And here's a guy who clearly felt a bit sorry for himself. His kids end up, or certainly his son ends up hating himself. The final score is pretty clear, isn't it?
The final verdict, I think, as we say in the book, is that Robert McNamara is guilty of tragically flawed leadership. It was a catastrophe for the United States. And looking back at his life, digging into his life the way that my brother and I did, I came away with a great aversion to Robert McNamara as a human being, for the way he conducted himself. I think I saw a humane quality within him, but the humane quality was suffocated by the ambitions of Robert McNamara.
Yeah, I think that's your very polite way of saying that he wasn't much of an advert for post-war America. You're still talking to your brother, Bill Taubman. You co-wrote this book with him.
Yes, I think some people are amazed we're still talking to one another.
I hope to get Bill on the show. Maybe we'll find another angle for this. Finally,
just let me interrupt to say the collaboration, our first on a book project, turned out to be really smooth. So it worked out very
so you
well.
at least you got something out of it. Two very, very brief questions. Firstly, you went in, you're a heavy hitting journalist, writer about post-war America. You already went in knowing a huge amount about this subject. Was there anything that surprised you, having done the research and written the book, that you didn't expect to come out in this book?
Yeah, I think the two things that jumped out to me were the role of this kind of contorted loyalty that drove Robert McNamara to prosecute a war that he knew was unwinnable. As I said earlier, there are often many explanations for why people do stupid things in Washington, evil things at times, ill-advised things. In this case, I think the overpowering reason that Robert McNamara prosecuted the war, stayed on as defense secretary, even though he knew prosecuting the war was a mistake, was because of this kind of blind loyalty to LBJ. The other thing that really surprised me was the depth of the relationship between Jackie Kennedy and Robert McNamara. I think if you ask most people who grew up during the Kennedy and Johnson years, they would tell you that the idea that Robert McNamara, it was called McNamara's War after all, that Robert McNamara grew close to Jackie Kennedy. How could that be?
Could they have possibly had a sexual affair?
We don't know, and we say so in the book, but
because there's also rumors that she had one with Bobby Kennedy after JFK's death. So
I don't know.
She was a complicated woman as well.
Look, we don't have evidence of a physical relationship, but we have a lot of evidence that we lay out of a very close, deep personal friendship that was cherished by both of them.
You are so politely euphemistic, Philip. You get my award for politeness. Finally, what 60 years later, Vietnam fortunately ended many years ago. We've had wars since then, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan. One of the things about Trump is he seems determined to keep America out of foreign wars, although who knows what will happen in either Ukraine, Taiwan, or even the Middle East. What are the historical lessons beyond the moral narrative about this complex Shakespearean character, Robert McNamara?
So I think there are several important lessons, and some of them McNamara drew himself years after the war and described in his own book about the war. And they are very much similar to the lessons that Colin Powell enunciated about what you need to do if you're taking America to war. And
of course, he himself has a little bit of the Bob McNamara in him, and he also lied about what weapons of mass destruction.
Yep. And so, some of the lessons that should have been applied in Afghanistan and Iraq and were not include, if you're going to go to war, make sure you have an exit plan before you start the war. So another one is, if you're going to take America to war abroad, make sure you do with overwhelming force. Another one is be prepared for the unexpected when you go to war. These are all lessons that McNamara himself drew, and one I would draw based on the Vietnam War and looking at the current administration in Washington is the question of what is the ultimate responsibility of cabinet members? Are they there merely to carry out the wishes and impulses of the president, or are they there to argue back, to dissent at times, and to make the case that a presidential impulse or decision is a mistake? I think McNamara failed to do that, and I think history will judge the Trump team as to how it behaves on that same core question.
Well, that's a good segue, Philip. I'm going to get your brother on to talk about the book too, but you bring a great deal of wisdom, of historical insight and foresight. Hindsight is, of course, always 20/20, but some people do that better than others. Philip Taubman, co-author of McNamara War, you make an enormously interesting and complicated case about Robert McNamara, the particularly tragic American Secretary of State, the man most responsible for Vietnam. Philip, thank you so much. Keep doing your excellent work. Much appreciated. Great to see you back on the show, and we'll get you back on again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.